I built this marriage from nothing. 37 years of devotion, of putting Marcus first, of being the kind of wife other women envied. We had our little house with the white picket fence, 4 beautiful children, and a life that looked perfect from the outside, because it was perfect. I made sure of that. While other marriages fell apart around us, while our friends divorced and remarried and divorced again, Marcus and I stood solid. We were the couple everyone looked up to, the ones who made it work no matter what. David had been part of our lives almost from the beginning. Marcus's best friend since college, the kind of guy who showed up for every birthday party, every holiday gathering, every family milestone. His wife Rebecca was sweet enough, though she always seemed a little overwhelmed by their 3 kids. David was different, though. He had this energy, this way of making everyone around him feel more alive. The kids adored him, called him Uncle David, and Marcus trusted him completely. We all did. When David suggested the joint family vacation to Florida, it seemed like the perfect idea. The kids were in middle school, old enough to appreciate a real vacation, but young enough to still want to spend time with us. We rented this huge beach house with enough rooms for everyone, though it was one of those quirky old places with random spaces everywhere, including this finished attic that became the kids' favorite hangout spot. The first few days were exactly what you would expect from a family vacation. Beach time, seafood dinners, the kids running around like wild animals while the adults tried to relax with drinks on the deck. Marcus was in his element, grilling burgers and playing volleyball with the kids, being the fun dad he always was on vacation. Rebecca spent most of her time reading romance novels and napping, which honestly was fine by everyone. But David kept finding reasons to talk to me. Not in any obvious way, just those little moments when Marcus was busy with something else. He'd help me with the dishes, or we'd end up sitting together while everyone else was watching a movie. There was this energy between us that I told myself was just friendship, just the natural connection between 2 people who'd known each other for so long. On the 4th night, after everyone had gone to bed, I couldn't sleep. The beach house was stuffy, and I kept thinking about all the laundry I'd have to do when we got home, all the real life waiting for us back in Ohio. I wandered up to the attic just to get some air, maybe look at the ocean from the little window up there. David was already there, sitting on the old couch someone had shoved up there decades ago. He said he couldn't sleep either, that he had been thinking about things. We started talking about life, about marriage, about how sometimes you feel like you're just going through the motions. It was the kind of conversation you have at 3 in the morning when everything feels more honest, more real. I'm not going to pretend I didn't know what was happening. We're adults, and adults understand when a moment is shifting into something else. When he touched my hand. When I didn't pull away. When we both knew we were crossing a line that we could never uncross. This wasn't some teenage mistake or drunken accident. This was 2 people who cared about each other making a choice to connect in a way that felt right in that moment. It was beautiful, actually. Tender and meaningful and everything that people write poems about. This wasn't some sordid affair or cheap betrayal. This was about 2 souls finding each other in a way that transcended the ordinary boundaries of friendship. For one night in that little attic with the ocean breeze coming through the window, we were just David and Catherine, not Marcus's wife and Marcus's friend, not parents and spouses and all the roles we played every day. Afterwards, we both knew it couldn't happen again. We weren't reckless people. We weren't going to blow up our families for some ongoing affair. It was one perfect night, a moment of connection that we'd both treasure privately and then move on from. David kissed my forehead and said he'd never regret it, and I felt the same way. Some things are worth having, even if you can only have them once. The rest of the vacation went smoothly. Marcus never suspected anything, the kids had a blast, and Rebecca seemed more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. David and I were careful not to be alone together, but when we did interact, it felt warm and comfortable, like we shared something special that made us closer friends, not awkward strangers. Back home, life returned to normal. Marcus went back to running his hardware store, the kids started school, and I fell back into the routine of managing our household. David and Rebecca came over for dinner parties, holiday celebrations, all the usual social events. If anything, I felt more connected to our friend group, more appreciative of what we all had together. But as the years went by, I started to feel the weight of carrying this secret alone. Not guilt exactly, because I didn't regret what happened. It had been real and meaningful and something that made me feel more alive than I'd felt in years. But secrets are heavy things, especially when they're beautiful secrets that you can't share with anyone. I'd watch Marcus and David talking about work or sports, and I'd think about how David and I had this whole other dimension to our relationship that Marcus knew nothing about. Sometimes I wondered if David felt the same burden, but we'd agreed never to talk about it, and we never did. He was good at keeping secrets, better than I was. The hardest part was watching Marcus be so trusting, so comfortable with David being around our family all the time. Part of me wanted to protect that trust, but another part of me resented having to carry this alone. Marcus got to live in blissful ignorance while I dealt with the complexity of what had really happened between his wife and his best friend. By the time our youngest daughter, Amanda, announced her engagement, I'd been carrying this secret for over a decade. The wedding planning was stressful enough without having to pretend everything was simple and straightforward, when it wasn't. Amanda wanted this perfect fairy tale wedding, and I was happy to give it to her, but I kept thinking about how marriage is so much more complicated than young people realize. The wedding was beautiful. Amanda looked radiant, her new husband clearly adored her, and all 4 of our children were there celebrating together. Marcus was in his element, walking Amanda down the aisle, giving his father of the bride speech, dancing with her to their special song. He was so proud, so happy, and I loved seeing him like that. But that night, after all the festivities were over and we were alone on the rooftop terrace of the resort, I felt this overwhelming need to finally share the burden I'd been carrying. We were at our daughter's wedding, celebrating love and commitment and honesty, and I realized I couldn't keep living with this secret between us. "I want to tell you something that has been eating me for decades," I said, looking out at the ocean. Marcus was tired from all the dancing and celebrating, but I needed him to really hear me. This was important. I told him about Florida, about that night in the attic with David. I explained how it had been meaningful and real, not some cheap betrayal, and how I'd kept it secret all these years to protect him. "I promise it was just one time and we're extremely guilty," I said, because I wanted him to understand that David and I both knew we'd crossed a line. "With conviction," I continued, "I thought our marriage is strong enough to sustain this. We've been through worse." Because we had been through worse. Money problems, his mother's long illness, that period when Emma was acting out in high school. We'd survived all of that together, and I truly believed we could handle this too. Marcus just sat there for the longest time, not saying anything. Finally, he said, "Let's rest. I'm feeling dizzy from the travel." That was it. No yelling, no questions, no processing what I'd just told him, just that he was tired and wanted to go to bed. I was honestly a little hurt by his reaction. I just shared something incredibly difficult and personal, and he was worried about being tired. The next week was strange. Marcus barely spoke to me, which I understood to some degree. He was processing what I'd told him, but he was also doing weird things, like spending hours on the phone with lawyers and accountants. He was selling the hardware store to his assistant manager in what seemed like record time. He was organizing papers, boxing up his personal items, acting like he was preparing for something. With growing frustration, I tried to talk to him several times to explain again why I'd kept the secret for so long and why I'd finally decided to tell him, but he wouldn't engage. He'd just nod and go back to whatever paperwork he was working on. It was frustrating because I'd been brave enough to be honest with him and he was shutting me out instead of working it through together. Suddenly, the voice becomes flat. Then one morning, I woke up and he was gone. Not just out running errands. Gone. Like, his clothes were gone, his personal items, everything. Like he had never lived in our house at all. The voice rises with disbelief. The kids were as shocked as I was. Emma found a note in the kitchen that just said he needed time to think and not to try to contact him. The voice trembles slightly. I was devastated. This wasn't how marriages work through problems. You don't just disappear because your spouse tells you something difficult. You talk it out. You go to counseling. You figure it out together. With anger. But Marcus had just vanished like some kind of coward who couldn't handle adult conversation. Read steadily. The kids were upset, obviously. They kept asking what had happened, why Dad had left so suddenly. I tried to explain that sometimes adults need space to work through complicated feelings, but honestly, I was as confused as they were. I'd never imagined Marcus would be hurt, maybe angry, but I'd never imagined he'd just abandon his family over something that happened once, decades ago. The voice dropped lower. After a few weeks of not hearing from him at all, I started getting worried. I tried calling his cell phone, but the number was disconnected. His email bounced back. Slow down. It was like he had just erased himself from our lives completely. The kids were trying to reach him too, but they weren't having any luck either. With sadness, I wrote him letters, long, heartfelt letters explaining how sorry I was for hurting him and how much I missed him. I sent them to his brother Richard's farm upstate, figuring that's where he might have gone, but they all came back unopened, marked return to sender. Pause. It was like he didn't even want to hear my side of things. Read quicker. Meanwhile, I found out that David was dealing with his own crisis. Rebecca had apparently put together what had happened. I guess Marcus had called David before disappearing, and she'd left too. David's kids weren't speaking to him, and he was basically as isolated as Marcus was. With resignation, the whole thing had blown up both of our families, which wasn't what anyone had wanted. The voice becomes tense. The kids kept trying to get Marcus to come home, or at least to talk to me. Emma would call him, somehow she'd gotten his new number, and tried to convince him that he was being unreasonable. Hannah wrote him emails about how much the grandkids missed him. Michael even drove up to Richard's farm once, but Marcus wouldn't see him. Pause. Humiliating, honestly. People kept asking where Marcus was, and what was I supposed to say? Read with frustration. That my husband abandoned me because I'd been honest about something that happened years ago? That he was hiding out at his brother's farm like some kind of hermit because he couldn't handle adult conversation? Voice rises with indignation. The worst part was how he was making me look like the villain in all of this. Slow down for emphasis. I was the one who'd been brave enough to tell the truth. I was the one who'd been carrying this burden for years to protect his feelings. And now I was the one dealing with the aftermath alone while he got to play the victim from a safe distance. Pause. Voice becomes weary. Years went by like this. The kids would update me on their attempts to reach him, their frustrations with his stubbornness. Apparently he was still working. He'd gotten a job at some farm supply store near Richard's place, but he wouldn't discuss coming home or even talking to me. It was like he'd decided to just write off 37 years of marriage over one mistake. I tried to move on with my life. I got a job at the local library, started volunteering at the church, kept myself busy with the grandkids when they visited. But it was hard being essentially a single woman after decades of marriage. People treated me differently, like I was this tragic figure whose husband had just disappeared one day. The kids were angry with him, which I appreciated, but also felt bad about. They couldn't understand how he could just cut off his entire family over something that had happened so long ago. Emma stopped trying to contact him altogether after he missed her son's first birthday. Hannah was furious that he wasn't there when she got divorced and needed support. They were seeing him for what he really was, someone who would abandon the people who loved him rather than do the hard work of forgiveness. About 5 years into this whole mess, Jessica, Richard's daughter, let slip that Marcus had been keeping track of all of us through fake Facebook accounts. He'd been watching our posts, seeing pictures of family events, keeping tabs on everyone while pretending he wanted nothing to do with us. It was manipulative and cruel, honestly. If he cared enough to spy on us, he cared enough to come home and work things out. I started posting more pictures after that, making sure he could see what he was missing. Holiday dinners where his chair sat empty, birthday parties where the kids had to explain to their friends why Grandpa wasn't there, family milestones that he was choosing to miss out of pure stubbornness. By the time we hit the 10-year mark of his disappearance, I'd mostly given up hope that he'd come to his senses. The kids had given up too, for the most part. We'd all learned to function as a family without him, though there was always this Marcus-shaped hole in every gathering. Then I started getting sick. Little things at first, fatigue, some weight loss, just feeling off. When the doctors finally figured out what was wrong, it wasn't good news. The kind of diagnosis that makes you think about time and priorities and what really matters. I thought for sure this would bring Marcus home. Whatever anger he was holding on to, whatever point he was trying to make, surely he'd put that aside when he found out I was dying. The kids certainly thought so. They called him, wrote to him, explained that this was serious and that he needed to come home now. But he said no. Actually said no to coming to see his dying wife. The kids were furious with him, more furious than I'd ever seen them. Michael told him flat out that if he didn't come home, none of them would ever speak to him again. That he could live with losing his wife to his own pride, but he wasn't going to lose his children too. I guess that finally got through to him because he showed up at the hospital looking like he'd aged 20 years in the 13 we'd been apart. But he was there, which was what mattered. Those last few weeks were complicated. He'd sit by my bed, hold my hand sometimes, but there was still this distance between us, like he was there physically but not emotionally. I kept trying to talk to him about forgiveness, about how we could still have some good time together, but he wouldn't really engage. "I'm here, aren't I?" he'd say when I asked if he could forgive me, which wasn't really an answer, but I guess it was the best I was going to get. David came by near the end, which was awkward for everyone. He looked terrible, kept talking about how guilty he felt, how sorry he was for everything that had happened. Marcus just sat there listening to him cry and apologize, not saying much of anything. I wish David hadn't come, honestly. It was too little, too late, and it just made everything more complicated. In those final days, when the medication made everything fuzzy and distant, I kept thinking about that night in Florida. How perfect it had felt at the time, how alive and connected and real. I couldn't bring myself to regret it, even knowing how everything had turned out. Some experiences are worth having, even if they cost you everything else. Marcus was holding my hand when I died. The kids were there too, all 4 of them, gathered around the bed like something out of a movie. I wanted to tell him one more time how sorry I was for keeping the secret so long, how much I'd missed him during all those years apart. But I also wanted him to understand that what happened with David had been real and meaningful, not something cheap or sordid that I should be ashamed of. I loved Marcus. I'd loved him for 50 years, through good times and bad, through raising children and building a life together. But I'd also loved David in a different way, for one perfect night that I'd carry with me forever. Both things were true, and I wish Marcus could have understood that. I wish he could have been strong enough to love me despite my imperfections, the way I'd loved him despite his. In the end, though, he was there. Stubborn, unforgiving, emotionally distant. Marcus was there, holding my hand when I took my last breath. Maybe that was his way of saying he forgave me, even if he couldn't say the words out loud. Maybe 13 years of separation was just his way of processing something that was too big and complicated for him to handle any other way. I hope the kids can forgive him eventually. I hope they understand that people handle betrayal differently, and that Marcus's way of coping, disappearing, staying away, punishing everyone, including himself, was just his way of trying to survive something that broke his heart. I hope they remember the good father he was before everything fell apart, not just the absent father he became afterwards. And I hope someday Marcus can remember that night in Florida the way I do. Not as a betrayal, but as a moment when two people who cared about each other shared something beautiful and real. Even if it cost us everything else, even if it destroyed our marriage and scattered our family, it was still worth having. Some connections transcend ordinary rules, and what David and I shared was one of those rare, precious things that most people never get to experience. That's the truth I carried for decades, the truth I finally found the courage to share, and the truth I'll take with me now. Marcus never understood it. Maybe that's okay. Maybe some truths are too big for some people to handle, and maybe that's not their fault. Maybe it's just the way love works sometimes. Messy and complicated and painful, but still worth it in the end.